You stayed again? Edward Whitmore's voice cut through the upstairs hallway so sharply that even the grandfather clock at the far end seemed to hesitate between ticks. Naomi Carter looked up from the small armchair beside Lily's bed, her hand still resting on the edge of a damp washcloth, her shoulders stiff beneath her pale gray uniform. For one suspended second, nobody moved. The nightlight near the dresser cast a soft amber glow across the room, catching the glassy shine of a medicine spoon, the half-empty cup of water on the nightstand, and the silver thread of rain sliding down the tall bedroom windows. Lily was finally asleep, curled beneath a cream-colored blanket, one small hand fisted in the sleeve of Naomi's cardigan, as if even in sleep she was afraid the room might empty out around her. Edward stood in the doorway in a dark wool coat still wet at the shoulders from the storm outside, his jaw set, his eyes moving from Naomi to his daughter and back again. Behind him, Margaret Hale appeared at the end of the hall, silk robe tied tight, face already sharpened by suspicion. The whole mansion seemed to listen. Naomi rose slowly, careful not to wake the child. She had another panic spell, she said, her voice low and even. Her fever spiked a little, and she wouldn't let anyone near her. Edward's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened, like cold settling deeper into stone. And somehow that required you to still be in my daughter's bedroom after midnight. His words were quiet, but they landed with the weight of accusation. Naomi glanced down at Lily, then back at him. She did not argue. She had learned that some houses had their own climate, and this one had been winter ever since Mrs. Whitmore's funeral. 3 months on staff, and Naomi already knew the sound of grief here. The hush of shoes on polished oak, the clink of untouched silverware at dinner, the way every door seemed to close more gently than before, as if the walls themselves were afraid of breaking something that had not healed. Lily had been the only exception. Her fear came loud, sudden, and thin as torn paper. Naomi had heard it from the service stairwell, just as she was clocking out, had paused with her coat folded over one arm and her tote bag hanging from her shoulder, and then had done what she always did when she heard a child trying not to sound afraid. She stayed. Margaret stepped closer, the satin hem of her robe whispering across the runner. "Edward, I said this would happen," she murmured, not nearly softly enough. "You let people blur lines, and then they start acting like they belong in family spaces." Naomi felt the sentence hit before the meaning fully landed. People like her. She kept her face still. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus balm, rainwater, and the expensive beeswax polish the housekeeping team used on every visible surface. Somewhere downstairs, thunder rolled low over the Connecticut shoreline, distant and patient. Edward took one step into the room, then stopped when Lily stirred in her sleep and tightened her grip on Naomi's sleeve. His eyes dropped to that tiny hand, to the instinctive trust in it, and something unreadable flickered across his face before vanishing almost at once. "Let go," Margaret said under her breath, though she wasn't speaking to Lily. Naomi gently eased herself back into the chair instead, moving with such care that the mattress barely shifted. Lily's breathing steadied again, soft and uneven, but no longer frightened. Naomi smoothed the blanket once with the back of her fingers. Then she looked up at Edward, calm in a way that made the silence heavier, and said, "I know what this looks like, sir, but I wasn't staying for the money." The words settled into the room with a weight that seemed too large for something spoken so softly. Naomi did not raise her voice after that. She did not explain herself, did not reach for pity, did not try to dress the truth in anything prettier than what it was. She simply sat there beside the bed, one hand resting lightly over Lily's blanket, while the storm pressed its cold palm against the window panes, and the amber nightlight drew a pale circle around the child's sleeping face. Edward Whitmore stood in the doorway as though he had forgotten why he came upstairs in the first place. His gaze lingered on Naomi for a beat too long, then shifted away, landing instead on the medicine spoon, the folded hand towel, the thermometer still resting near the lamp. Small things, domestic things, evidence not of intrusion, but of care. Margaret noticed it too, and that seemed to sharpen her expression even more. "Then why are you staying?" she asked, her tone crisp enough to cut through cloth. Naomi looked at her, but only for a second. There was no defiance in her face, no tremor either, only the stillness of someone who had spent years learning how to survive other people's assumptions without handing them the satisfaction of a reaction. She could feel the cardigan sleeve still caught in Lily's hand. Tiny fingers, warm from fever, trusting in sleep what the waking world had not yet earned. She needed someone not to leave, Naomi said. That was all. Margaret let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. That is not your place. Naomi lowered her eyes to the child again. Somewhere beyond the bedroom door, the hallway lights glowed low against cream wallpaper and old family portraits, casting every gold frame in a tired, expensive shine. The Whitmore house looked beautiful at night from a distance. From the inside, it felt like a museum where grief had been left out on display, but nobody was allowed to name it. Edward finally stepped into the room, slow and careful now, as though he had become aware of how loud a person could feel just by entering the wrong silence. He moved to the side of the bed and looked down at Lily. Her cheeks were flushed from crying, but her breathing had evened out. Her lashes lay still against skin still damp from the washcloth Naomi had pressed there minutes earlier. He placed 2 fingers against the edge of the blanket, almost touching his daughter, then stopped when her hand tightened again around Naomi's sleeve. It was such a small motion, but it changed the air. For the first time that night, the certainty left his face. Not gone, only cracked. Margaret saw that too, and she folded her arms. Edward, she is an employee, she said, each word clipped and neat. You start confusing service with devotion, and people take advantage. Naomi had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. In hotels, in private homes, in hospital waiting rooms, in church basements after long days and longer weeks. People liked kindness when it came neatly packaged, easy to schedule, easy to dismiss. But the moment it stayed too late, the moment it refused to clock out on time, they began to mistrust it. Edward said nothing for a while. Rainwater slipped from the hem of his coat onto the hardwood in quiet, measured taps. At last he reached up and loosened his tie, not because he was relaxing, but because it suddenly seemed to sit too tight at his throat. Go home, Miss Carter, he said, though his voice had lost its edge. I will have someone sit with her. Naomi nodded once, but before she could rise, Lily shifted under the blanket and whispered through sleep, thin and frayed, do not close the door. The room went still all over again. Naomi felt Edward look at her then, not as a maid who had crossed a line, not even as a problem to be handled, but as someone who might know something he did not. And in the cold, polished quiet of that house, that was the first real change. Edward did not answer his daughter right away. He only stood there beside the bed, his hand still resting on the blanket, while the words drifted through the room like something too fragile to touch. Do not close the door. Lily had not fully woken when she said it. Her eyes stayed shut. Her face remained turned toward the pillow. But the fear in her voice was real, thin and instinctive, the kind that did not belong to dreams alone. Naomi saw the change in Edward before he spoke. It was small, almost hidden, just a tightening in his throat and a stillness in his shoulders, as though some private memory had reached up from the dark and taken hold of him. Margaret opened her mouth, perhaps to insist again that Naomi leave, but Edward lifted one hand without looking at her. Not now. The 2 words came out low and tired. Naomi gently eased her sleeve from Lily's grasp, inch by careful inch, but the child stirred at once, her breathing catching, her fingers searching across the blanket. Naomi placed her hand back near the pillow without touching her, and Lily settled almost instantly. The room gave up its tension by degrees. Edward noticed. He noticed everything now. How Naomi never moved too fast, how she kept her voice below the hum of the air vent, how she let silence do some of the work instead of trying to fill it. The rain softened outside, falling in a quieter rhythm against the window glass. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked as one of the overnight staff passed, and then thought better of coming closer. Edward straightened and looked at Naomi with a kind of guarded uncertainty that did not suit a man people obeyed for a living. Leave the door open, he said at last. Naomi nodded. Margaret stared at him as if he had broken some family law older than the house itself. But she said nothing more. 10 minutes later, Naomi stepped into the upstairs corridor with her coat folded over one arm and her tote hanging from her shoulder. The hallway lamps had been dimmed, and the portraits along the wall seemed softer now, their stern expressions blurred by low light and distance. Edward followed her out and pulled Lily's bedroom door until it remained open 3 inches, then stopped there, one hand still on the brass handle. "She has been doing that since the funeral," he said, not looking at Naomi. The door, the panic, the nights. His voice carried none of the authority it had before. It sounded like a man admitting he had been living beside a locked room and did not know where the key was. Naomi slipped her cardigan sleeve back into place and adjusted her grip on her bag. "Some children are afraid of the dark," she said quietly. "Some are afraid of being left alone inside it." He turned toward her then. The hallway light caught the exhaustion under his eyes. The kind expensive suits and perfect posture could not hide forever. "You think that is what this is?" Naomi looked back toward the narrow opening in Lily's door. Warm amber light spilled through it, a thin line across the polished floorboards. "I think she listens for endings," Naomi said. Doors closing. Footsteps leaving. The sound of someone deciding they are done staying. Edward said nothing after that. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it had changed shape. It no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like thought. When Naomi finally walked downstairs, the house seemed less like a mansion and more like a place where sorrow had been trying to speak in a child's language for months, while all the adults kept missing the translation. Morning arrived without color. The rain had passed, but the sky over the Whitmore estate still hung low and silver, pressing a thin, cold light through the kitchen windows and across the marble counters. Naomi Carter stood at the far end of the breakfast room arranging Lily's tray with the same careful precision she used when folding linen or polishing crystal, though this felt nothing like service. One slice of toast cut into neat squares. A small bowl of strawberries with the white centers trimmed away because Lily never touched them otherwise. Oatmeal thinned with warm milk so the spoon would not drag. Nothing too loud, nothing too bright, nothing that asked too much of a child who woke every day as if the world had already disappointed her before breakfast. Naomi set the tray down and noticed, from the corner of her eye, Margaret watching from the doorway with a look that could chill steam off tea. "You are not her mother," Margaret said, arms folded over a pearl-colored blouse, her voice light in tone and heavy in meaning. Naomi adjusted the folded napkin beside the plate before answering. "No, ma'am," she said. "I know that." Margaret stepped into the room, heels tapping softly against the stone. "Then do not start behaving like the house cannot function unless you are hovering over one child." Naomi did not rise to it. She only lifted the small glass of water and set it closer to the tray, the way Lily preferred, within easy reach and never directly in front of her. "She did not eat much last night," Naomi replied. "This is only in case she feels up to it." Margaret exhaled through her nose and said nothing more, but the silence she left behind felt full of judgment. Upstairs, footsteps moved across the landing. Edward. Naomi recognized his pace now, measured, controlled, almost too controlled, as if even grief had been instructed to stay inside its lane. He entered the breakfast room already dressed for work in a charcoal suit and crisp white shirt, though the strain around his eyes made him look as though sleep had only passed by his door and never come in. His gaze settled first on the tray, then on Naomi, then on Margaret. For a second, nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the hall marked the quarter hour with a soft chime. "She is awake," Edward said at last. "But she will not come downstairs." Naomi nodded once as if he had simply confirmed whether she already felt in the air. "May I take this up to her?" Margaret let out a small sound of disbelief, but Edward answered before she could. "Yes." The word surprised all three of them. Naomi picked up the tray and started toward the staircase, moving slowly enough to keep the spoon from rattling against the china. On the second-floor landing, she paused outside Lily's room, where the door stood open exactly 3 inches, just as Edward had left it in the night. Naomi did not knock right away. She reached first to the wall sconce beside the door and turned the dimmer lower, softening the white morning glare into something warmer. Then she crouched and straightened the edge of the hallway runner where it had curled upward, making sure no sudden scrape would startle the child inside. Only after that did she tap gently on the doorframe. "It is Naomi," she said. "I brought breakfast, but you do not have to eat unless you want to." No answer came at first. Then, from somewhere inside the room, a small voice, rough with sleep and caution, said, "Is the door still open?" Naomi glanced down the hall, where Edward had followed more quietly than she expected, and now stood half hidden in the shadow near the staircase, listening. She looked back toward the narrow line of amber light touching the floorboards from Lily's room and said, "Yes, sweetheart. It is still open." Naomi stepped into the room with the tray balanced carefully in both hands, moving slowly enough that the spoon did not click against the china. Lily was sitting upright now against a row of pillows, her pale yellow quilt gathered at her waist, her hair tangled from sleep, and her eyes still carrying the distant, watchful look of a child who never fully trusted morning. The television remained black. The curtains were only half drawn. Light came in thin and cool through the tall windows, but the room still held the warmer glow of the night lamp by the bed, and Naomi could feel at once that Lily preferred it that way. Not bright, not wide open, not too sudden. She set the tray on the small table near the bed and kept her voice low. "I brought the oatmeal the way you liked it yesterday," she said, "and the strawberries without the white centers." Lily looked at the tray, then at Naomi, but did not reach for either. Her eyes flicked once toward the door. It was still open 3 inches, just enough to show a narrow strip of hallway runner and the edge of the walnut console table outside. Naomi followed that glance and understood something she had only begun to suspect the night before. It was not darkness Lily feared. It was the finality of things. The shut of a door. The sound that meant someone had chosen the other side of it. Naomi pulled the small chair near the bed, but did not sit right away. She crossed to the door instead and rested her hand lightly on the brass knob without moving it. "Would you like it a little more open?" she asked, "or exactly like this?" Lily stared at her for a long second, surprised by the question itself. Then she whispered, "A little more." Naomi opened it another 4 inches, enough that more light touched the floorboards, but not enough to expose the whole hall. Lily's shoulders loosened by something small but real. Naomi sat then, folding her hands in her lap. "Better." Lily nodded once. It was the first sign of preference she had given anyone that morning. From the hallway, Edward stood just beyond view, close enough to hear, far enough not to crowd the moment. Naomi knew he was there by the stillness behind the doorframe, by the faint scent of his cedar cologne mixed with coffee, by the sense of a man watching a language he had never learned begin to make sense in front of him. Lily lifted the spoon at last, but halfway to her mouth she froze. Somewhere downstairs, a pantry door closed with a hard wooden thud. The sound traveled upward through the house, like a memory. Lily's hand jerked. Oatmeal trembled and slid back into the bowl. Her breathing changed at once, shallower now, her eyes fixed on nothing Naomi could see. Naomi did not rush to touch her. She simply leaned forward and said, very gently, "That was downstairs. You are still here. The door is still open." Lily's gaze snapped back to the narrow opening beside the bed. Naomi pointed to it with one finger, not making the gesture big, only steady. "See it?" Lily swallowed and nodded, small and fast. Naomi continued in that same calm voice, the kind that gave a child room to borrow someone else's breathing until her own returned. "Nobody left this room. Nobody closed you in." After a few seconds, Lily's grip on the spoon loosened. Her next breath came deeper. In the hallway, Edward shifted his weight, and the polished floor gave a faint creak beneath his shoe. Naomi glanced up just enough to catch the shadow of him through the crack in the door. He did not move away. He stayed there listening as his daughter took one cautious bite, then another, and in that quiet room, with the cool New England morning pressing softly at the windows and a child measuring safety by inches of open space, the first real truth began to take shape between all of them. Lily had not been asking for attention. She had been asking for proof that someone would still be there when the door should have closed. By late morning, the house had resumed its polished rhythm, but it was the kind of rhythm that only proved how much effort went into pretending nothing fragile had happened upstairs. Vacuum lines appeared in the rugs. Silver trays passed through the kitchen in quiet hands. The scent of lemon oil and fresh coffee drifted through the first floor as if order itself could be restored by shine alone. Naomi Carter moved through it all with her usual care, a basket of folded hand towels balanced against her hip, her face unreadable, her pace steady. She had changed out of her cardigan and back into the clean gray uniform kept in the staff closet for emergencies, but the sleeve Lily had held on to all night still seemed to linger in the shape of her thoughts. In the laundry hall, The industrial dryers gave off a low hum, warm and constant, while sunlight filtered through the narrow service windows in pale strips across the tile. Naomi was stacking fresh pillowcases by size when she heard Margaret Hale's heels before she saw her. Sharp, measured clicks. The sound of someone who never had to ask for a path to clear. Two housemaids near the ironing station straightened instinctively. A pantry assistant looked down at the inventory clipboard in his hands as though numbers might protect him from being included in whatever was coming. Margaret stopped beside the folding table and picked up one of the pillowcases between two fingers, examining it the way some people handled things they thought existed beneath them. "I have seen this before," she said, not looking at Naomi. One act of attention, one moment of softness from the family, and suddenly the help begins to imagine they are part of the household. The room went still in the particular way service spaces do when dignity is about to be tested and everyone present knows it. Naomi finished aligning the edge of the last folded towel before lifting her eyes. "I am only doing my job, ma'am," she said. Margaret gave a thin smile. "That is exactly the point. Jobs are paid. They are not invitations." Her gaze slid over Naomi's face, then over the room, making witnesses of everyone without giving anyone the courage to object. "People stay where the money is. I would simply prefer honesty over sentiment." Nobody spoke. The dryers kept turning. A single metal hanger clinked softly against a laundry rack and then went quiet. Naomi felt the words land where they were meant to land, but she also felt something else beneath them, something older than insult. Fear. Not hers. Margaret's. The fear that kindness from the wrong person could expose how little the right people had understood. Naomi lowered her eyes and reached for another stack of linens. "Then you have misunderstood me," she said, her voice calm enough to make Margaret's look sharpen. "Have I?" Margaret asked. "You stay late. You hover near Lily. You rearrange rooms that are not yours to arrange. You answer questions that were not asked of you. Do not mistake temporary access for importance." One of the maids shifted beside the ironing board, her face tight, with second-hand discomfort. Naomi did not look at her. She only smoothed the crease of a fitted sheet with the side of her hand, and said, "Children notice who leaves." Margaret laughed then, but it was a brittle sound, polished and cold. "And ambitious women notice opportunity." That line might have hung there unanswered if another voice had not entered the room at exactly that moment. "That will be enough, Margaret." Edward Whitmore stood just beyond the service doorway, one hand on the frame, his expression controlled but not blank. He had probably heard only the end of it, yet something in his face suggested it had been enough. The laundry hall seemed to shrink around the silence that followed. Margaret turned toward him, surprised less by his presence than by the fact that he had spoken at all. Edward did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Carter is an employee of this house," he said. "She will be treated with respect while she is in it." Naomi looked at him then, only briefly, but it was long enough to see that even now his defense came dressed in formality. Employee. Respect. The language of rules, not trust. Still, it changed the air. Margaret set the pillowcase back down with careful fingers and drew herself upright. "Of course," she said, though the chill in her tone remained. Then she walked out, leaving the faint scent of gardenia perfume behind her like something too expensive to be warm. Edward stayed where he was for a moment longer. His eyes moved to Naomi, then to the stack of child-sized pillowcases on the table, then back again. "My daughter is asking for you at lunch," he said. "Only for lunch." The pause before those last three words was small, but not small enough to miss. Naomi understood at once what lived inside it. Permission and warning, given in the same breath. Lunch was served in the sunroom just after 1, when the weak winter light finally broke through the clouds and laid pale rectangles across the long white table. The room overlooked the back gardens, where bare hedges stood neat and silent under a sky the color of brushed steel. Naomi carried in a tray with grilled cheese cut into narrow strips, apple slices without the peel, and tomato soup poured into a small porcelain cup, so the scent would reach Lily before the spoon did. She set it down carefully at the far end of the table, where Lily sat in a cushioned chair with her knees tucked up beneath her and her eyes fixed on the window. Edward was already there, laptop closed, untouched coffee cooling beside his plate. Margaret sat opposite him with a linen napkin across her lap, posture exact, expression unreadable. The moment Naomi turned to leave, Lily's voice stopped her. Stay. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But in that house, where the child had spent months speaking only when necessary, the single word landed with the force of something larger than sound. Naomi paused with one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair beside Lily. Edward looked up first at his daughter, then at Naomi. Margaret lowered her fork with deliberate care. She can eat, Margaret said smoothly, without turning every meal into theater. Lily's fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth. Naomi saw it. So did Edward. A beat passed. Then he said, Miss Carter may remain until she finishes. The correction in his voice was subtle, but it was enough to draw a small breath from Lily, the kind a child takes when the floor beneath her has not shifted after all. Naomi sat in the chair beside her, not too close, hands folded in her lap. Lily dipped the grilled cheese into the soup and took a bite. Then another. No coaxing, no bargaining, just quiet, cautious eating, as if safety had made room for hunger again. Edward watched the whole thing without pretending not to. Margaret did too, and the disapproval in her face deepened with every swallow. Sunlight caught the rim of the soup cup, the polished silver spoon, the fine strands of Lily's hair where they fell across her cheek. The room was peaceful, but it was the kind of peace that made hidden fractures easier to hear. By the time the tray was half empty, Lily had stopped staring at the window and begun asking Naomi small questions in a voice still fragile from disuse. Did the kitchen still keep cinnamon cookies in the blue tin? Was the snow coming this week? Would the hallway light stay on tonight? Naomi answered each one simply, never too fast, never too brightly, giving the child a place to rest her thoughts without feeling handled. When lunch ended, Naomi rose to collect the dishes, but Edward stopped her with a glance toward the open French doors leading to the side corridor. A moment, he said. Outside the room, the warmth dropped at once. The corridor was cooler, lined with old oil paintings and polished brass sconces that gave off more elegance than light. Naomi stood with the tray balanced in one hand while Edward faced her with both hands in his pockets, his expression composed in the careful way men look when they are trying not to reveal the struggle underneath. You have been helpful, he said. I am not denying that. Naomi waited. Somewhere behind them, silverware touched china in the sunroom with soft, distant clicks. Edward continued. But this cannot become something else. My daughter is vulnerable. She is grieving. Attachment, under circumstances like these, can turn quickly into dependence. Naomi kept her eyes on him, calm and still. He looked past her shoulder as if the next sentence were easier to deliver to the wall. From this point on, I need you to limit your contact with her to assigned duties only. No lingering outside her room. No extra time after your shift. No more blurred lines. The words were formal, but their sharpness came from fear, not cruelty. Naomi heard that. Maybe because she had heard it before in hospitals, in foster homes, in every place where people mistook distance for protection. She adjusted her grip on the tray and nodded once. Yes, sir, she said. Edward looked relieved for half a second, and guilty the next. Naomi turned and walked toward the service hall, the scent of tomato soup still rising faintly from the tray, the afternoon light stretching long and cold across the floor. She did not look back, but when she passed the side table near the stairwell, she noticed a small drawing left there in crayon on hotel stationery from some old fundraiser dinner. It showed a little square room, a yellow lamp, and a door standing open. In the corner, written in careful, uneven letters, was one line. Do not forget tonight. That evening the temperature dropped fast, and by 6 o'clock the first fine grains of snow had begun to drift across the Whitmore estate, catching in the beams of the driveway lamps like ash made weightless. Inside, the house glowed with that same expensive stillness it always wore after dark, all polished wood and softened lamps, and rooms too large for the people living in them. Naomi finished her last assigned task in the upstairs sitting room, straightening a stack of art books and folding the throw blanket at the end of the sofa into one clean square. She worked more slowly than usual, though she told herself it was only because the fabric was thick and the corners kept slipping. Edward's words from lunch had stayed with her through the whole afternoon, quiet but firm, the kind of sentence that pretended to be about rules while hiding fear underneath. Assigned duties. Only. No extra time. No blurred lines. By 7:15, Naomi had changed into her navy coat in the staff room and pulled her tote onto her shoulder. On the small metal locker door in front of her, her own reflection looked back tired and older than 31, the fluorescent light above flattening every softness in her face. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded crayon drawing Lily had left near the stairwell earlier. Do not forget tonight. Naomi closed her hand around it for a second, then let it go. Upstairs, a door opened. Then another. Fast footsteps crossed the landing. The sound came sharp through the house, stripped of all its careful manners. Naomi froze halfway to the service exit. A child cried out from the second floor, not loud at first, but ragged, the way panic starts when it is still trying to disguise itself as fear. She heard Margaret's voice next, tense and too bright. Then a housemaid. Then Edward, lower than the others, saying Lily's name once, then again. Naomi stood still, one hand on the brass push bar of the exit door, while the cold from outside pressed faintly through the glass. It was not her place. He had made that clear. The cry came again, higher now, fraying at the edges. Something fell upstairs, not broken, only dropped in haste. Naomi shut her eyes. She could see the room without seeing it, the lamp too bright, too many adults moving at once, concern turning heavy in the air until a child could no longer breathe inside it. By the time she reached the bottom of the main staircase, she stopped herself before the last step. She did not go farther. She did not cross into the upper hall. She stood exactly where the polished banister curved toward the foyer, one level below the commotion, and lifted her voice only enough for it to carry. Lily. The crying did not stop, but it faltered. Naomi kept her tone even, the same way she had by the bed, by the breakfast tray, by the half-open door. It is Naomi. I am downstairs. I am not coming in. I just need you to listen to me. Silence hit the house, so suddenly it felt physical. Even the adults upstairs stopped moving. Snow tapped softly against the tall front windows. Naomi rested one hand on the banister, grounding herself against the smooth, cool wood. Can you hear the clock in the front hall? She asked. A beat passed. Then another. Somewhere above, Lily's crying thinned. Naomi waited long enough for the old grandfather clock to answer with a low, familiar tick. That means the house is still here, Naomi said. Now listen for my voice. I am still here too. She heard a breath catch upstairs, then a smaller sound. Almost a sob, almost a reply. Edward did not interrupt. Nobody did. Naomi went on, each word slow enough to step on. The door is open. The hallway light is on. Nobody is shutting you in. You do not have to be brave all at once. Another long pause. Then, from the second floor, came the sound of feet moving across carpet instead of pacing over it. Naomi imagined Lily turning toward the doorway, imagined her small chest trying to match someone else's breathing because her own felt impossible. That is right, Naomi said softly. Just listen. One breath in, one breath out. I am still right here. When the child finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and trembling, but it was clear enough for every person in that house to hear. You stayed. Naomi felt the words land somewhere deep and old inside her, somewhere she had spent years keeping closed. She looked up toward the shadowed landing, though she could not yet see Lily from where she stood. Yes, sweetheart, she answered. I stayed. And above her, in the charged stillness of that grand Connecticut house, the panic that no doctor, no schedule, no careful distance had been able to ease began, at last, to loosen its grip. For a few seconds after Naomi answered, nobody in the house seemed willing to disturb what had just happened. Snow kept drifting past the front windows in soft diagonal lines. The grandfather clock in the foyer counted out the silence with its patient tick, and above that sound came something the Whitmore home had not heard in months. Lily breathing without panic. Naomi remained where she was at the foot of the staircase, one hand resting on the banister, her coat still buttoned, her tote still hanging from her shoulder, as if she were standing between leaving and being needed. Then a small figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Lily stood there in pale blue pajamas, one hand gripping the railing, her face blotched from tears, her hair loose and uneven around her shoulders. Edward was just behind her, not touching her, not crowding her, his expression stripped bare by disbelief. Margaret stood farther back in the hall, rigid and silent, as though the scene unfolding in front of her had no place in the order she trusted. Lily looked down through the open space of the stairwell until she found Naomi below. "Do not go yet," she whispered. The words were rough, but they were steady enough to make Edward close his eyes for the briefest moment, as if some private grief had just shifted shape in front of him and he did not know what to do with the relief. Naomi stepped away from the door and up the first stair, then stopped there, keeping the distance in the exact place Lily could measure it. "I am here," she said. "You do not have to come down if you do not want to." Lily shook her head once. Then, slowly, she took one step. And another. Edward moved with her, careful, watchful, but he did not guide her. Naomi stayed exactly where she was, low enough not to loom, steady enough to be found. By the time Lily reached the final 3 steps, her breathing had grown thin again from effort, but not from fear. She looked at Naomi the way children look at something they do not yet trust enough to name, but already know they need. Then she crossed the last bit of distance and leaned into Naomi's coat with a small, exhausted certainty that made the entire foyer feel suddenly smaller, warmer, more human. Naomi set her toad on the floor and wrapped one arm lightly around her, not too tight, only enough to tell the child where the edges of safety were. Lily pressed her face into the wool at Naomi's shoulder and went still. Edward stood 3 feet away, motionless. The lamplight from the foyer caught the shine in his eyes before he turned his head slightly, but not before Naomi saw it. It was not weakness. It was a father watching the impossible happen in the arms of someone he had spent all day trying to keep at a distance. Margaret descended 2 steps, then stopped, unsettled by the tenderness of the moment, and perhaps by what it revealed about everyone else. "This is not sustainable," she said, but even her voice lacked conviction now. Edward did not look at her. He was watching Lily, the loosened shoulders, the unclenched hands, the absence of terror in the child's face. "No," he said quietly. What was not sustainable was before. The words hung in the foyer like something honest enough to change the temperature of a room. Naomi felt Lily's hand twist gently into the fabric of her coat, not with panic now, but with simple need. Upstairs, a lamp still burned in the half-open bedroom. Downstairs, the fire in the library gave off a low, steady crackle. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Edward finally looked at Naomi, and in that look there was still caution, still pride, still the habits of a man who had spent too long trying to master pain by organizing it. But there was something else now too, something harder for him than suspicion. Gratitude. Quiet and unadorned. Unmistakable. By the time Lily finally fell asleep, the house had softened into that late-night hush only old homes seem to know, when every lamp burns lower than usual and even the air feels careful not to disturb what peace it can find. Naomi sat in the small reading chair beside the library fireplace with Lily curled against her shoulder, the child's breathing warm through the wool of her coat. One hand still closed around the seam near Naomi's collarbone, as if sleep itself might slip away if she let go. The fire had burned down to a bed of quiet orange coals. Shadows moved gently across the bookshelves, over leather spines and framed photographs and the polished edge of Edward Whitmore's desk. He stood near the mantel with one hand braced against it, jacket removed, shirt sleeves rolled once at the forearms, looking less like a man in command of an empire and more like someone standing in the wreckage of a question he had not known how to ask. Naomi did not speak first. She only kept one hand light against Lily's back, matching the child's breathing without seeming to. At last Edward stepped forward and lowered his voice. "I have had specialists in this house," he said. "Doctors, grief counselors, child psychologists from Boston and New York. They all had credentials, treatment plans, appointments marked down to the minute." His gaze shifted to his daughter, then back to Naomi. "None of them could do what you just did from the bottom of the stairs." Naomi looked down at Lily's sleeping face before answering. Firelight warmed one cheek of the child's face, while the other stayed soft in shadow. "She did it," Naomi said quietly. "I only gave her something steady to reach for." Edward let out a breath that sounded too tired to be called a sigh. "You keep saying things like that." Naomi raised her eyes. "Because they are true." For a moment he studied her with the kind of focused men like him usually reserved for balance sheets and negotiations, as if somewhere inside her calm there had to be a system he could map, a reason he could label, a cause and effect that would make him feel less helpless in his own home. But Naomi's composure offered him no neat edges, only presence. Only patience. Only something that did not perform itself for approval. Edward moved to the armchair opposite hers and sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Why does she trust you? He asked. The question came out stripped of pride, plain enough to matter. Naomi took a second before she answered. Because I do not ask her to be less afraid than she is. The fire clicked softly in the grate. Somewhere beyond the library doors, the grandfather clock marked the half-hour. Edward looked at Lily again, and when he spoke next his voice had changed. I have spent months trying to fix this. Naomi's expression gentled, though not with pity. Children know the difference between being managed and being seen, sir. That sentence landed hard enough that he looked away. On the side table near his chair sat Naomi's tote, where she had set it down after Lily reached for her and refused to let go. A corner of folded paper stuck out from the top, crayon blue against worn canvas. Edward noticed it now. What is that? He asked. Naomi followed his glance, then reached for the drawing and held it without opening it. Something your daughter left for me. He nodded once, then rose. I need to ask you something practical, he said, returning at last to the kind of tone that let him stand upright inside himself. Have you been claiming overtime for any of this extra time? Naomi looked almost surprised by the question. No, sir. Why not? Her answer came simple and immediate. Because I was not staying for extra pay. Edward went still. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a brief ribbon of sparks. Naomi adjusted Lily slightly higher against her shoulder and added, I never submitted the hours. He said nothing after that. But later, after Naomi carried Lily upstairs and laid her down with the door open 4 inches and the hallway light left dim and warm, Edward stood alone in his study with the payroll file open on his desk. Page after page confirmed what she had said. No overtime requests. No special bonuses accepted. No reimbursement forms for the late rides she never took. Then his eyes stopped on one small deduction note attached to her direct deposit record, voluntary and recurring, $40 every Friday to a pediatric grief center in New Haven. Edward stared at the line for a long time, the lamplight catching on the gold edge of the paperweight near his hand, and for the first time that night, he began to understand that Naomi Carter had not simply stayed. She had carried a reason into his house that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a sorrow he had not yet seen. The next morning arrived clear and brittle, with sunlight flashing off the fresh snow like powdered glass and turning every branch outside the Whitmore windows into something sharp and white. Naomi was in the breakfast pantry polishing water glasses when Mrs. Ellis from payroll appeared at the doorway, hesitant in a way Naomi had never seen before. She held a slim manila folder against her cardigan and glanced once over her shoulder before stepping inside. Miss Carter, she said softly, Mr. Whitmore asked for your file last night. Naomi's hands paused on the stem of the glass. For a second, the only sound in the pantry was the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant clink of silver being laid out in the dining room. All right, Naomi said. Mrs. Ellis did not leave. Instead, she lowered the folder onto the counter between them, careful as someone setting down news too delicate to carry farther. He saw the donation line, she said. Naomi looked at the folder, but did not touch it. Sunlight from the high pantry window fell across the paper in a pale square, catching the typed numbers near the edge. $40. Every Friday. Month after month. Year after year. She had forgotten, for one foolish moment, that wealthy men often believed answers could be found by opening the right file. Her throat tightened, though her face stayed still. I did not think it was anyone's business, she said. Mrs. Ellis's expression softened. I do not think he knew what he was looking at until he asked me where the pediatric grief center was. Naomi closed her eyes for half a breath. Not from shame. From the effort of standing upright inside a memory that had already begun to rise. The room around her remained bright, orderly, full of clean glass and folded linens, and the smell of coffee brewing somewhere close by. But another room moved quietly beneath it now, one from years earlier, painted in hospital cream, with a vinyl chair beside a narrow bed, and a little boy whose breathing she had learned to count in the dark. Caleb, 7 years old. A cowlick that never stayed flat. Small hands always too warm when the fevers came. He had hated closed doors too. Not because of the dark, but because every time one shut in that hospital wing, some part of him believed the person on the other side might not come back. Naomi had slept in chairs, on benches, with her cheek against cold walls, listening for the rise and fall of a child who never asked for much except one thing spoken over and over in a tired little voice. Stay till I fall asleep. She had stayed through treatments, through winters, through the hollow brightness of waiting rooms decorated for holidays that felt cruel in their cheer. And then one spring morning, when the trees outside the hospital had just started to green, she had stepped out for less than 3 minutes to sign discharge papers no one would ever use. Long enough for a nurse to find him reaching for the empty doorway with frightened eyes. He had not died alone. She knew that. She had been told that gently, more than once. But grief is rarely persuaded by facts. It keeps its own record. Naomi opened her eyes and found Mrs. Ellis still standing there, quiet and kind and wisely unwilling to say she was sorry. My son passed away 6 years ago, Naomi said at last, the words plain as folded cloth. After that, I started giving to the center because they helped me remember what care looked like when I could not see much of anything clearly. Mrs. Ellis nodded once. Mr. Whitmore is in the conservatory, she said. He has been there since 7. Naomi looked through the pantry door toward the long, bright hallway beyond, where winter sun lay across the floor in clean white bands. Somewhere upstairs, a child laughed softly for the first time, brief and uncertain, like a sound trying out its own existence. Naomi set down the glass in her hand and felt, with sudden certainty, that the truth she had spent years carrying quietly through the world was no longer hers alone. The conservatory sat at the east end of the house where the winter light came in clean and merciless through panes of old glass, turning the tiled floor pale as frost and throwing long shadows from the potted citrus trees lined along the walls. Edward Whitmore stood near the center table with both hands braced against its iron edge, a white porcelain cup untouched beside him, the coffee inside gone thin and cool. He looked up when Naomi entered, and for the first time since she had come to work in his home, there was no authority in his face waiting to speak before the man did. Only weariness. Only recognition. Naomi stopped a few feet away, her hands folded loosely in front of her apron, the morning light catching on the silver thread at her cuff where the fabric had begun to fray. Neither of them spoke at first. Beyond the glass, snow clung to the garden hedges in careful lines, and somewhere in the kitchen wing a tray rattled faintly, then went still. Edward reached for the payroll file on the table and closed it with one hand. You should have told me, he said quietly. Naomi's eyes rested on the folder, but did not move toward it. About Caleb? She asked. He nodded once. The name seemed to land harder on him when she said it aloud. I am sorry, he said. The words came out unadorned, stripped of the polished control that usually wrapped everything else he said. Not just for what I found out. For all of it. For assuming the worst of you. For speaking to you as if care could only be real when it came from someone with the right last name. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him to the glass roof where weak sun warmed the metal beams without softening them. Grief makes people grab at what they can control, she said. Sometimes that means schedules. Sometimes doors. Sometimes distance. Edward let out a breath and lowered his eyes. And sometimes it means pushing away the one person your child trusts because you are afraid she might trust that person more than you. Naomi did not answer immediately because truth spoken that plainly deserved silence around it. At last she said, Lily is not replacing anyone, sir. She is reaching for what feels steady. Edward nodded, but there was something else unsettled in him, something unfinished. He walked to the far side of the table, opened a drawer beneath the ledge, and took out a small cream envelope. He turned it once in his fingers, then held it toward her. This was found in my wife's hospital things after she passed, he said. Margaret packed most of it away. I did not go through everything. Not really. Not until last month. Naomi looked at the envelope without taking it. Her breath caught before she meant it to. Edward noticed. It has your name on it, he said. Slowly, Naomi reached for the envelope. The paper felt thin and expensive under her fingers, softened at one corner as if it had been handled once, and then hidden from grief before it could be read. She opened it carefully. Inside was a card no bigger than a photograph, with Claire Whitmore's handwriting slanting gently across the front. Naomi read the first line and had to steady herself against the back of a chair. If Lily starts shutting the world out, please do not let her disappear inside that silence. The conservatory blurred for half a second, glass and snow and sunlight all fading behind the shape of a hospital room from another time, another loss. Claire had written more. Thank you for the way you sat with her when I could not stay awake. Thank you for not treating fear like an inconvenience. If she reaches for you after I am gone, please, do not step back just because others will misunderstand. Naomi closed her eyes. She had not seen the note before. Claire must have written it during those last days when the morphine made time slippery and speech uncertain. Edward's voice came softer now, changed by the weight of what he himself had failed to know. You knew her before you worked here, he said. Naomi nodded. At St. Agnes. I worked nights in the family support wing after Caleb died. Your wife used to sit with Lily in the pediatric garden when she came for treatment. We spoke a few times. That was all. Edward looked at her, as if the whole past month had just rearranged itself in front of him, every assumption falling out of place. And you still came here without saying any of this. Naomi folded the note back into its envelope with careful fingers. Because I did not want her last words turned into permission, she said. And I did not want your daughter to feel like one more promise was being kept out of obligation. Behind the half-open conservatory door, a floorboard creaked. Margaret stood in the hallway, motionless, one hand still on the frame, her face gone pale in the morning light. Whatever she had come to say did not survive what she had just heard. Edward turned toward her, but she lowered her eyes first. For once, she had nothing sharp enough to hide behind. That night the house felt different in a way no one could have measured, only noticed. The heat hummed softly through the vents. The sconces along the upstairs hall cast a gentler light than usual, and every door on the second floor seemed to close with more care, as if the walls themselves had learned something and were trying not to forget it. Naomi stood in Lily's room folding back the cream-colored quilt while the child changed into fresh pajamas behind the carved privacy screen near the wardrobe. On the bedside table sat the yellow lamp turned low, a glass of water half full, and a new box of crayons Edward had brought home on his way back from the office, still unopened, as though he had finally understood that comfort did not always arrive looking important. Lily climbed into bed without protest and held up a sheet of paper. I made something, she said, her voice still soft, but no longer fragile in the same way. Naomi took the drawing and smiled. It showed a small room, a lamp, snow at the window, and 3 figures standing beneath an open door. One was tall in a dark suit. One wore a gray dress. The third had yellow hair and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. Above them, in careful, uneven letters, Lily had written 4 words. Everybody stayed this time. Naomi looked at the page for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she set it beside the lamp and tucked the blanket lightly under Lily's arms. That is a good drawing, she said. Lily studied her face with the seriousness children reserve for things that matter. Are you leaving tonight? Naomi glanced at the doorway. It stood open 4 inches, just as it had the night before, but now the opening did not feel like a plea. It felt like a promise being kept. No, Naomi said. Not until you are asleep. Lily nodded and settled deeper into the pillow. A few minutes later Edward appeared at the threshold, not entering right away, one hand resting against the doorframe. He had removed his tie and changed into a dark cashmere sweater, but he still carried himself with that same restrained precision, as if some habits of control would take longer than grief to soften. In his hand was an envelope, not cream like the one from Claire. Heavy, formal. He crossed the room and placed it gently on the dresser. This is for you, he said. Naomi looked at it, but did not touch it. She already knew from the weight and the paper what it was meant to be. Edward noticed and gave a small, almost embarrassed nod. It is not enough, he said. For what you have done. For what I assumed. For what I failed to see. Naomi stood slowly, careful not to disturb Lily, and picked up the envelope. She felt the thickness of the check inside, the easy power of money trying to make itself useful in the face of something it could not undo. Then she handed it back. Edward's brow furrowed. Miss Carter. Use it for her therapy, Naomi said quietly. For the night nurse if she needs one. For the garden room she likes. For whatever helps her feel less alone in this house. Edward stared at her, the envelope still in his hand, and for the first time there was no shield left in his face at all. Only humility. Only the painful clarity of a man realizing that the purest thing offered to his family had come from the person they had all been quickest to misunderstand. Behind him, Margaret stood in the hall, silent in a soft beige cardigan, her usual sharpness nowhere to be found. She took one step into the room and looked at Naomi with eyes made older by shame. "I was wrong," she said. "No defense. No polish. Just that." Naomi met her gaze and inclined her head once. She did not ask for more. She did not need to. Lily's breathing had already begun to lengthen into sleep. Edward set the envelope aside and reached for the yellow lamp, lowering it another shade. Warm light settled over the bed, over the drawing beside it, over Naomi's hands folded softly at her waist. Snow moved past the window in slow white lines. The hallway remained open. The room remained still. Edward looked at his daughter, then at Naomi, and said in a voice barely above the hush of the heater, "She did not stay because we paid her. She stayed because she knew what it meant when no one did." Naomi did not answer. She only sat once more beside the bed as Lily drifted fully under, the child's hand resting near the edge of the blanket instead of clutching for it. And in the quiet gold light of that winter room, nobody said anything else, because sometimes the deepest kind of